I am very open about my own social and political views with my students and about my own personal development towards advocacy and raising my voice. But my goal in my classes is not to indoctrinate students into my worldview, rather to guide them to thinking critically about the world around them and not take for granted what is presented to them, especially by a teacher. The beauty of written reflections is that it allows students to lead the conversation and share with each other rather than responding to my questions or comments. The topics we have covered over the past couple of years have varied greatly, depending often on current issues that arise or interests that different classes have. For example, students wrote responses about the comments of the British Museum on the repatriation of the Parthenon marbles. This brought up for my students issues of cultural ownership, access to knowledge, and precedents repatriation might set, dividing the class between those who strongly supported their return and those who sympathized with the Greeks but were unsure they should be given back. Students also read the New Yorker article on color on ancient statues and architecture, which was something many of them had not known about before and profoundly affected the way they thought about the ancient world and the ways it has been co-opted by white supremacists to falsely claim support for a white Western heritage in Europe and the United States. In fact, when given a project to create podcasts last spring, two of my students reached out to Dr. Mark Abbey and Dr. Jennifer Stager to learn more about the topic because they had been so fascinated by the ways in which the article had changed their view of antiquity. The students in my Augustus class this year responded to a New York Magazine article drawing comparisons between Trump and Augustus. And I was blown away by their sophisticated critique of comparative history and the risk of being reductive or misleading. One of the most eye-opening writing responses came this year when my Latin 4 class responded to Trump's executive order that all federal buildings should be neoclassical. I asked students to think about the city of Philadelphia and their architectural experience of the city, given that our school sits right in the heart of the neoclassical parkway. Students had taken their environment for granted their entire lives, and reading about the problems with Trump's executive order and the implications about power and race inherent in it transformed their view of their lived space. As my student Lewis wrote, being disposed to regularly visiting these sites, the Philadelphia population is heavily influenced by the architecture, and from a young age is taught that classical architecture is synonymous with power and importance. This is incredibly problematic because it encourages subconscious white supremacy. Another student of mine, Julian, in our class discussion, could not get over how deeply this article had impacted his understanding of the city for him. Thinking about different neighborhoods, about spaces built to exclude, and especially about the shocking juxtaposition with the neoclassical parkway and the many homeless people who sleep along the parkway and how they are predominantly African American. I would like to share some more in-depth examples of the responses that I've received in my classes about 3 different uses of written reflection. One open, one with a prompt, and one use that focused on advocacy in the field. In Latin 3 Roman Women last year, after reading Livy ab urbe condita excerpts discussing the rape of the Sabine women, students were asked to reflect on the Latin that we read and on the end of the story with the attack of the Sabines, the death of Tarpeia, and the eventual cessation of violence at the women's behest in translation. They were asked to write a reflection, but it was up to them to shape their response as they wanted. A couple of students focused on female voice and agency, writing, women in the Livy paragraphs are silent and or not particularly smart, except when intelligence would benefit men in power. And on internalized misogyny, as the women claim they are the cause of strife. My student Olivia writes, this adds significantly to the blame that the women bear for their own kidnapping and rape. I thought that the gaslighting and victim blaming were very powerful. The women's autonomy is taken from them by their rapist husbands, and this leads to the complacency that Livy mentions as natural to women, as well as their sense of shame and responsibility for the rape. One student compared Livy's portrayal of the Sabine women to Rousseau's assertion that women's only role and only want is to have children. They define women by their family and nothing else. Earlier in the school year, around the time of midterm elections, We had read a Guardian article about silencing of women during the voting period, and Catherine Topper's Eidolon article, Pandora's Ballot Box, which another number of students referred back to, citing similar techniques of silencing and gaslighting in the ancient world and today. Last year, Sportula published anonymous statements about the mistreatment of interns and staff by the then governing members of the Paideia Institute, which issued an immediate response on in medias res from Paideia itself on October 15th. Given the severity of the accusations and the general uproar within the field of classics that erupted, I asked my students at all levels to write responses around 3 prompts. 1, do you think the Paideia Institute's response to Sportula's statement was sufficient? Why or why not? Or 2, what is Paideia's responsibility now given the claims that have been made? And 3, what should the future of Paideia look like? As a whole, my students believed that the response of Paideia was insufficient given the claims made in the Sportula piece. And I want to add that this is specifically to the October 15th response and not to work that's happened afterwards. They made statements such as, the language used by the board of directors in Paideia's statement comes across as passive-aggressive and disingenuous as they bluntly avoid an actual written apology. And I felt that the apology was very forced and generic. I get this feeling from certain words like misjudgment, trying to justify problems that could easily have been avoided through common sense or just caring about your employees. I also assume this because of how much promotion of Paideia there is instead of real apologies. Regarding their responsibility, it is to focus on listening to complaints made and having conversations about difficult topics in their workplace, and to diversify its board and leadership positions in a way that women and people of color will have a seat of power where they cannot be spoken over or ignored by other members of the board who are white, cis, male. One of the overarching themes about the future of Paideia, and one of the reasons I chose this example, was that Paideia was just one symptom of a much larger problem. As my student Peter writes so eloquently, I fear that focusing so heavily on the condemnation of Paideia misses the true target of these accusations, the classics establishment as a whole. Isolating a small target and making an example out of them may ultimately lead other racists and misogynists in the classics community to take the defensive and assert their beliefs in different ways. At the end of last year, our keynote speaker, Danny Bostic, wrote a review of the racist language in the textbook Latin of New Spain. While the publishers Bolcasi Carducci immediately removed the book from their website and set to work on an updated version, positive reviews of the textbook remained linked in the post for it, and are in fact still there. My upper school students and I decided to use our written reflections to advocate for positive reviews of this book to be removed from the journals that had published them after they read both a positive review in one particular journal, Danny Bostic's review of the work, and a resource from Evaluating American Indian Materials and Resources. Students wrote following the prompt, what is the journal's responsibility to their readers and to American Indian, Native American populations with regards to these reviews and why? My students rallied to the cause, writing such responses as, I can only imagine what Native American people throughout history have suffered, and the fact that repression of their culture and mistreatment still occurs to this day is horrifying. So to have a publication glorify these events that led to mass murder and abuse is a slap in the face to Native Americans everywhere. The review site should publish an apology addressed to Native American populations directly, addressing why what they did was wrong and steps they will take to ensure that something like this will not happen again. And allowing materials like this is a dangerous slippery slope that can end up breeding racism and ignorance. Students are required to take the materials given to them by their educators as the truth in many instances and valid tools for their education. And the journals have an incredible responsibility to the classics community and the American indigenous populations to remove the review of the book. The entire review wholly fails to make any mention of any problems in the book, except a few entries are missing from the commentary. In this way, they align themselves with the teachings of the book. While nothing ultimately came of the advocacy and the reviews unfortunately remain up, students learn that they can use their voices to speak up against oppression with reflective, measured language, and that a thoughtful response to bigotry and other problems is more useful than a gut reaction response. In fact, recently, connected to a written reflection and classroom discussion, two of my students, Hannah Dubb and Olivia Schumann, published pieces on Danny Bostic's blog, Ad Iquiora, calling out sexism and misogyny in the NJCL. I have greatly valued introducing written reflections into my curriculum for so many reasons. The least of which is that as an educator, I found it previously difficult to generate and maintain deep discussions in class. These responses have allowed this to happen naturally and have allowed myself and my students to explore together various issues of importance, both to our understanding of the ancient world and its impact on us and to our daily lives. By looking at and thinking critically about issues writ large, they develop the skills to identify behaviors and tackle the everyday interactions of microaggression that they come into contact with or personally face. Reading the responses that my students have written also makes me marvel at their personal development. The difference between the reflections that many of the boys in my Roman women class wrote at the beginning of the last school year to the reflections I asked them to write as part of their final exam that year was amazing and showed a level of sophistication that they just were not capable of 9 months beforehand. As teachers, we have the often daunting responsibility to help shape socially minded individuals who will fight for justice and equity in the world around them, even just at the one-on-one level. With the tool of written reflections to prompt engagement and guide discussion, I feel somewhat better prepared for the task. Thank you.